Hello, this is Tamara Anderson from Building Successful Lives Speech and Language Services. I have an excellent guest today, Dr. Karla Washington, for my Diversity, Culture, and Equity series. She is a professor of communication sciences and disorders at the University of Cincinnati, and she focuses her research on typical and disordered speech and language development in monolingual and bilingual contexts. Dr. Washington is active in the National Institute of Health sponsored research investigating Jamaican children's speech productions. She is an editor for the Journal of Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in the Schools, and she's a member of the International Expert Panel on Multilingual Children's Speech. Welcome, Dr. Washington. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you, Tamara. It's lovely to be here. I very greatly appreciate the opportunity and the chance to, always showcase and talk about Jamaican children, which is one of the Caribbean children who are expats living in different parts of the world. And for this context, in America, or North America, I should say, so the US and also Canada. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. And I know June in the United States is Caribbean American Heritage Month, which is why I invited you on this particular month. So I'm very happy that you were able to join today. And we will be discussing developmental language disorder. And we know that it is one of the most common early childhood disorders and contributes to difficulties with receptive, expressive, and pragmatic language disorders. It is prevalent in 7 to 15% of kindergarten children, and it is not due to hearing impairment, autism, or an intellectual disability. It affects 5 times more children with autism. Developmental language disorder contributes to reading difficulties in 50 to 70% of children. And additionally, approximately 20% of children in the United States are actually bilingual, and they speak another native language, including some Caribbean children. And there are other children that are multilingual and speak 3 or more languages. This month, like we said, we are highlighting Caribbean heritage. And the primary reason for this interview today, we'll be focusing on bilingual Jamaican children. So Dr. Karla Washington, turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so very much. And allow me to, of course, go through my disclosure just to highlight what they are. Some of the projects I will be talking about today to contextualize my research has been funded at the federal level, and also very happy that we had endowment funds that gave us our initial start on this path. And it would not have been possible without the parents, the families, the schools, and the children themselves who made it possible that this research could be here today, that I could talk about Jamaican children and their speech and language, and also my partners around the world. I also mentioned Professors Laura and Richard Kretschmer, and of course my family that made it possible, that gave me time to be away as I collected these data.
The first question is, what is Jamaican Creole, and is it the native or primary language for all Jamaican children?
This is a great question. I know Confucius has said true wisdom is knowing what you don't know. And so for me, that was a question I wanted to answer so that then I could better characterize what speech and language looks like in this population of speakers. And I'm going to answer this question less as a yes, no, but sort of give you a narrative and then give you that final binary answer. So linguists do consider the Jamaican context and other Caribbean contexts to be what they refer to as diglossic. So where you're going to have 2 closely related languages operating in existence. And there are tensions between these languages where one is high status and one is low status. So in the Jamaican context, that high status language is English, and the low status is the Creole, in this context, Jamaican Creole. Now, it is considered a language that has heritage languages in West African and English, but it's now considered to be an independent language. So it's not a dialect, it's in fact a language. And quite often that distinction between dialect and language is more political than it is linguistic in origin. I mentioned here that most Jamaicans use Jamaican Creole and English within their daily life, changing which language they're used depending on the social context. It would be just similar to a monolingual speaker who changes their register. How do you speak to your teacher versus how do you speak to your friend? Because the Creole in this context is considered to be more the language of the people. It's more informal, whereas English is the language of instruction, commerce, business, education, and government. Now, a main characteristic of the Jamaican context is that you have a large number of Jamaicans, in fact, children, who are characterized as simultaneous bilinguals. So they are learning and they are exposed to those two languages from birth. Some within the context, it also comes through television as well as the home. And then when they go to school, they're getting English in the classroom, but on the playground, you're hearing that rich Creole as they play and romp around, as they say in Jamaica. Now, Jamaicans are somewhat unique in this realm where we refer to, you're more likely to see Jamaican Creole English bilinguals only coming from Jamaica, unlike other bilinguals, so people who are Spanish English bilinguals, French English bilinguals, Arabic English speaking bilinguals, they come from many other places. And so to understand Jamaican Creole speakers, understanding Jamaica and how language is used in Jamaica is the best origin. Now I talked about diglossic, but I mentioned here that Jamaica and other Caribbean countries are considered to be this post-Creole continuum. So you're going to have people speaking polar varieties, which would be the English and then the Creole, but then there's that mix in between. So you do have code mixing between the two polar codes that exist. So to answer your question, it is a native language in the Jamaican context, where it's considered to be the first language of many Jamaicans, and that fact has yet to be contradicted since 1971 when it was produced. When his name was Craig, that asserted that Jamaican Creole is the first language of most Jamaicans, and that observation does hold to today. So I hope I have answered your question.
Yes, excellent information. I know in the speech pathology world, sometimes they wonder, is it a dialect? Is it a language? I'm glad you cleared that up, for lots of folks have been asking me that. So I definitely appreciate that. Excellent explanation. The other question is, what are the linguistic characteristics of bilingual Jamaican Creole and English-speaking children?
Okay, well, this question stems so nicely from the one you just asked me, and that is in describing Jamaican Creole speakers as coming from a diglossic background and a post-Creole continuum, with one language being a heritage language of the other, you're going to find that there are similarities in the phonological, lexical, grammatical features between the two languages. So similarities exist in terms of things like sentence structure. So there's a subject, verb, object sequence. So she is eating. So you have the subject, verb, object. She is eating cake. And then you also have word order for descriptors, such as you have the girl nice or the nice girl. But one thing that's really important to recognize is that for Jamaican Creole has 90% English vocabulary. So part of the reason why sometimes you might understand what the child is saying is because there's a lot of shared lexical items between the two. So you hear boy and boy. Phonologically, the pronunciation is different, but lexically, the item representation is the same. Also, I should point out that the Jamaican phonological system, in terms of the number of sounds, is different from what is in English. So the Jamaican system consists of about 22 consonant sounds and 12 vowel sounds, which is different in quantity from the English phonological system, which has 24 consonant sounds and 20 vowel sounds. So you see there's almost a doubling in the number of vowel differences and just a slight difference in terms of the consonants. Now, like English, I mentioned, Jamaican Creole does evidence two basic sentence structures: subject, verb, object, and descriptive, with a number of features within those that are similar. What I would like to point out at the phonological level, there are certain sounds that are shared between the two languages and sounds that are not shared. For example, the theta, voiced and voiceless, so like the TH sound in this versus the TH sound in that, are absent in the Jamaican repertoire of sounds, whereas they are present in English. So what you might hear from a Jamaican Creole child who's bilingual is you might hear T for that alveolar sound to replace the voiceless TH, and D for the voiced. So when you hear this and that, or teat and that, those should not be considered errors, but instead more evidence of language transfer and language interaction between children who come from this language background.
Great, great. It's good to note those hallmark differences in the phonology.
And what I just wanted to give an example of here is my lovely niece who is growing up in a home where she does hear the Creole and the English. She's also exposed to Spanish and French. So she is actually in Canada, where French as a country has two main languages, two first languages, English and French. So a lot of kids learn the French in school. Now, I referred to that linguistic continuum before. So in the Jamaican context, plural is marked as a free morpheme. It's not bound like in English. So in English, you might say books. In Jamaican Creole, you say book them. So when you hear a child saying to book them, that's going to be very dissimilar. Then they're getting close to book. Oh, but they forgot the S. Oh, we have to work on that plural. But remember, they're coming from a context where pluralism is marked as a free morpheme, not a bound morpheme. So dissimilar, which is Creole, to more the English, which is what you expect. So just understand that that's what that continuum looks like. Next, there's the lexical variation. Any British Commonwealth person might say gleaner or newspaper, and it's the same lexical item, just two different words. So I just wanted to provide that representation so that you have a pictorial view of what might happen when you hear a child who's bilingual Jamaican Creole speaking.
I like that because you can see the difference with the semantics, the phonology, and the morphology right there. Another question is, what are some of your previous and or current research projects that seek to evaluate if these bilingual children have developmental language disorder, articulation or phonological disorder versus a language and speech sound production differences? And what are the results or preliminary findings thus far?
Well, thank you for this question, Tamara. And in fact, we have worked on research that addressed each of these. So I'll go through them very quickly. One of the studies that's published in Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in Schools, we used what's called a psycholinguistic framework from the 1990s to try to characterize what Jamaican Creole children's grammar system looked like. Are they similar between the two, and is it any different from what we might expect from monolingual speakers of the ambient language? So we tried to characterize grammatical production in Jamaican Creole across 62 children using their spontaneous language samples. So we had children engaged in play with language-specific toys and language-specific clinicians, and they were between the age of 4 and 6. So they played with the toys, we talked about the toys in each language, and then we recorded what they were saying. Later, we overlaid this framework that looked at noun phrases, verb phrases, questions and negations, and their overall sentence structure. What we did find was that there was similarity between the structure of Creole and English. There were certain similarities, which is unsurprising given that one language is a parent language of the other. But we also found that there were only 56 structures in this psycholinguistic framework, and the children produced only 32 of those structures. So what does that tell us? That there might be structures that you're expecting to hear from this child who can speak English, but isn't using it, or they use it differently. So we found that they do have somewhat similar structures. They are represented differently. And so when you see those differences, and this is where we found that this framework allowed us to consider something called code mixing, or cross-linguistic interaction, where when someone who speaks two languages on a daily basis, those languages don't hang out separately from each other. They blend together sometimes, and what you hear in the child's production might be features that sound agrammatical for the ambient language, but is in fact a feature of the native tongue. We also recently published another paper in Language, Speech, and Hearing Services, answering the question of developmental language disorder versus typical development by Wright, Karam, and myself. And what we wanted to find out was this question of the appropriateness of standardized measures being used to answer the question of typical or disordered development in Jamaican children. Now, you're probably wondering, what did we find out? Well, we asked, is it appropriate to use these measures? Actually, when we looked at, what we did was that we considered adult models from the same linguistic community. Now, the international expert panel from which I am a member, and it's chaired by Professor Sharon McLeod and Dr. Sarah Verdon, one of their recommendations is to, in fact, use adults from the same linguistic community. So if you find that adults from the community have certain linguistic patterns, whether they be phonological or morphological, then if they're using it and they're grown, if we see children doing it, then we know this is not just an error. It's part of the developmental sequence, and it's actually representative of the language context. And that is what we found. We found that children were demonstrating patterns in their morphological structures very similar to the adults. And when we tried to score the children based on the standard rules of and we use the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals in this case, we were getting almost 38% of children being misidentified. 38% being misidentified with DLD, rather than when we rescored and that percentage dropped significantly.
Right, because you have to make the considerations through what is syntactically Jamaican, because of Jamaican Creole,
exactly.
Not mark those errors, be conscious
and not
of what the differences are syntactically or morphologically to not count.
Exactly.
That's a big,
and one of the
30-something%.
Yes, and one of the things that we found, I'm sorry, say that again.
It's quite significant.
Thank you, we agree. And we are thankful for our reviewers who accepted our paper and said, yes, this is information that we do need our readership to hear. And we chose speech and hearing services in schools intentionally because we knew it would reach the school-based speech language pathologist. As an example, in the English context, when you're looking at present progressive, you're expecting a child to use is, root verb, and ing. But in the Jamaican context, there's no bound morpheme for that. You're likely going to hear, instead of the boy is running, you might hear the boy a run. Now you're hearing run because remember there's that shared lexical, but that is actually the is an aspect marker telling you when the situation occurred, and it's a continuative aspect in that case. We've also examined
the is kind of marking that he's doing it presently.
Correct. Yes. So that marks the continuative aspect tense, which is the present progressive tense in English. So just to realize the structures are there, they're just marked differently. I mentioned here to you this particular measure, which is now moving on to intelligibility. It's the intelligibility in context scale, which we translated and validated in the Jamaican context. Now, because Jamaican Creole is an oral language, we actually provided a recording of this to use with parents. We wanted to be able to provide a measure that gave us some understanding about how children use their language to be understood and included with others. And here we look at how well being able to be well understood allowed this for Jamaican children. I will say that this measure has been translated in over 60 different languages and is freely available, and it's on the list of resources that I have shared with you for your audience. So this is called Measure for How Much Other People Can Understand the Picnic, Jamaican.
Let's see.
And so there. And so this measure just asks parents questions about their children's intelligibility across different listeners. And we were able to not only validate and translate it, but we have now provided more psychometric evidence to show that the tool can distinguish between typical and disordered. And my doctoral student, Michelle Leon, took the lead on that paper.
Another question there is, what is the international classification of functioning, disability, and health for children and youth? And how do you apply this framework during your research studies?
Well, thank you for asking this question. I have been using this framework since I was a student. And in fact, the doctoral program where I was trained, my education was framed around this framework, which is provided by the World Health Organization. It is a biopsychosocial framework that allows you to comprehensively characterize a person's functioning and disability in the context of their environment. So it allows you to be culturally responsive. So you think about where that person is from and what that person is used to doing in terms of characterizing, well, is this typical or is this disordered? And as a framework, this is what it looks like. So it considers health, the health condition, because in fact, health is considered a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, with communication being considered a health condition. This framework is in fact adopted internationally, including by the American Speech Language Hearing Association, Speech Language Audiology Canada, the Royal College of Speech Language Therapists in the UK, as well as speech language in Australia. I'm forgetting what their title is, but it's also in Australia. And so it provides more of a universal way of considering what we think about functioning and disability by considering body functions and structures, activities such as the ability to talk and to walk. But then how do you use those abilities to be included with others? And this is where we sort of break down in our field. When we work on children's ability to say sentences correctly and to use words intelligibly, why do we do that? We use that so they can be included with others, so that they can enjoy life, to play for children, which really is their job at this point in their lives. And so we need to think about things, well, what is the environment that the person is from? And what kind of personal characteristics, likely informed by that person's cultural background, is going to impact on the evidence that we see when they use sounds, when they put sentences together, when they choose words from their vocabulary, and then when they try to include themselves with others. Are there certain social characteristics that are different from a person from a particular background, from another person from another background? And so we try to understand that person in context in order to help understand whether they're typically developing or they are disordered. It also frames us in thinking about what is multilingualism. We can think more broadly about what it is and know, in fact, that multilingualism is the norm and not the exception. So when we consider that framework, that more holistic framework about functioning in people, we have an understanding of anchoring where is it that most people are coming from. Well, they're coming from a multilingual background, which refers to people who comprehend and produce 2 or more languages in these different forms with at least a basic level of proficiency.
And how do students in the University of Cincinnati's Communication Sciences and Disorders program benefit from studying abroad in Jamaica? I think that's a fantastic that the students have that opportunity to do that.
Well, thank you.
Abroad.
Yes, thank you. And I have to thank my university. They put their money where their mouth is and really supported this endeavor. Back in 2012, we had a provost who invited faculty across the university to develop these programs because they had a strategic plan about improving or expanding upon students' learning opportunities outside the borders of the traditional classroom to support what we call experiential learning. So the intent of this program is to provide students with an international perspective and experiences about communication and communication disorders in children who are culturally and linguistically diverse. I always say to my students, everyone is culturally and linguistically diverse. We all have a culture. If you don't travel outside of where you're comfortable in, you never realize you have one because then everybody around you is the same. But the moment you leave, you realize, oh, wait, I do have an accent. Oh, wait, I use words differently. Oh, the way I interact is not the same as you. So this is part of the reason why universities want their students to travel, so that they understand that we all are different, not just some people, we all have a culture. And so our Education Abroad program offers this experiential learning. We can learn about children's voices, and also my goal is to improve my students' cultural competence, responsivity, and humility. And that humility piece is more having them be other-oriented. Learn about the other person through the other person's eyes, not what you expect the other person to be. Learn it from being immersed in their culture. And this cultural competence will allow you to incorporate at all levels assessment, vigilance, expansion, and adaptation to what you have in front of you. So being able to, for example, instead of just using the test in the standard way, understand what variations you might expect when a child is going to produce certain language features. Do we have a way of rescoring what we just heard to understand what is accuracy? So then broadening what our definition of accuracy is outside of monolingual English speaking norms. And then as part of the experience, I expose my students to learning about difference and disorder, because somebody who's different can be disordered. And it's not that because they're different, they can't be disordered. So this notion of misdiagnosis can occur, where you see typical patterns of someone who uses more than one language being an indicator for a disorder in someone who doesn't. So being able to hold true those two concepts in our mind, difference and disorder, the difference being it is very rule governed, it comes from a systematic way of using and understanding, and disorder would be something that is deviant from what you might expect, not only from the person's background, but from that ambient language. Underdiagnosis and overdiagnosis occurs, and it does come at a hefty cost to the educational system. And I will end this question by saying there is no evidence that being multilingual, you have higher or lower rates of speech and language disorders, and there is no correlation between multilingualism and disorder. So my students get this cross-cultural, hands-on, immersive experience to see it for themselves, having to make decisions in the field to then fatigue that reflex of fear of what's different linguistically, because they have a textbook understanding of certain constructs, but now they have an opportunity to actually realize the knowledge that they learned in the classroom.
And before we go on to this question, I'm curious, did they go to more of Kingston, the city portions, or did they go to different parishes in the country, or did it vary?
Great question. Yes, we actually go to Kingston, and the reason we chose Kingston is because I know within Kingston, you're going to have people from all across the island come to Kingston. And so they're getting introduced to children whose Jamaican Creole and language use is influenced from all across the island, with different kinds of socializations happening, languages, and they also work with the parents and the teachers. So that idea of that diversity of language exposure, rather than it being a particular region in Jamaica, I try to do a more diffuse and broader exposure to what Jamaican Creole would look like and be experienced. And of course, I take them to the beach, and we go to Devon House. I'm going to give a shout out to Devon House. It's the 4th best ice cream in the world. No wonder it was hard for me. Yes, it is so delicious, and they get jerk chicken, jerk pork, you know, the usual, and at the same time learning about Jamaican culture, people, and which includes their language use.
Yes, I think that's great that they get the opportunity to go to Kingston so they can get a variety of the different influences of Jamaican Creole regionally. That may be some differences there. The next question are, what are some practical tips that monolingual and multilingual SLPs can implement to distinguish developmental language disorder versus linguistic difference here in the United States?
Well, one of the things I mentioned right away off the bat, just a few tips, is to consider terminology that they're using. So language guides thinking. And that's often why people change laws, is to help change your thinking. So the written language is going to guide your cognitive thinking. And here, Jamaican Creole speakers, it's a language or a variety of English. It is not a dialect. It's not a broken language. So from the start off, a practical tip: change your language, change how you're talking about these kids. And if you work from there, it gets a bit easier. The next practical tip is to redefine what accuracy is. It's not just binary. Accuracy is multidimensional. How do we know something is right or wrong? Ask a lawyer. They will tell you it depends. Are you guilty, or are you notice they don't say innocent. They say guilty, not guilty. Why? Because innocence is this term that's hard to break apart. And so I say redefine accuracy to take into consideration language interaction and transfer effects, because we know that languages don't operate in a vacuum. They are dynamic constructs. And so if someone speaks more than one language on a daily basis, the likelihood that features of one transfer over into the other is undoubtedly going to occur. They say that you're guaranteed certain things in life. One of them is taxes. The other one is that a child who speaks 2 languages, they're going to code mix their languages. So a practical tip is to have that expectation. Then consider the language background and context. So what can you use? Use YouTube. Go to YouTube, see what's out there. Refer to sites like the Multilingual Children's Speech, ASHA's special interest groups. Use Google. There's so much rich information. Making use of comprehensive assessment practices. You can watch the child in action, talk to the parents, teachers, siblings, make use of those resources, making use of also dynamic assessment practices, and find out what resources actually exist for this population. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. Trust me, when you go out there and Google, you will find things. Now you're going to have to use your judgment and your senses to make sure that you're thinking about some of the things you find out there. But there are many useful things that already exist, because I don't want to increase the burden that we know a lot of our school-based SLPs are already facing, but just to help you not just work harder, but smarter. And lastly, I'll say, don't afraid to be creative. So with the Jamaican context, we know a few things about it. They're diglossic, there's a tension between the languages. Some people might not want to admit that they speak the Creole because it's considered to be a lower language, but do understand that Creole is a language that's spoken in Jamaican society, and it's going to influence the features of English. There's going to be the likelihood that you're experiencing these children on your caseload, because there is a growth in places like the United States, Canada, and the UK. So this linguistic paradigm of speakers is likely to end up on your caseload. One of the things also, as I said, that it is a language, and I hope my video works here. This is just a video to illustrate to you that Jamaican Creole stands apart from its heritage languages. This speaker is from West Africa, which represents one of the parent languages of Jamaican Creole, and this speaker is Jamaican. So do you think they're going to say these words in front of you in the same way or in different ways? Let's see.
And as I mentioned, we want to be able to have be able to consider the context. Remember to change our verbiage about how we speak about the language. And in this situation, I reminded you that Jamaican Creole is a language and not a broken language, and it's not a dialect. And evidence of this is this illustration that had been making the rounds on TikTok, where we have a speaker of one of the heritage languages here, West African, and then our Jamaican speaker. Here's a list of words. Let's see if they say these words similarly, or there might be differences in their pronunciation.
Forest, bottle, bako, pomegranate, panganat, macaroni, vitamins, vitamin, pago, military, oil, aisle. Then how do you say aisle? Aisle. Plantain. Plantain. Coconut. Neighbor. Tomatoes.
So indeed, there are differences. There are these phonological differences between these words that are shared between these languages. So having an idea what the pairing looks like and sounds like, and know about how that language pairing might impact the experiences that those children have on your caseload. And then, what resources are available? For Jamaican Creole speakers, for example, there are slam cards that are available on the Leaders Project website hosted by Kate Crowley at Columbia University. And there are also many other types in other languages available. And also for children who might not even speak other languages, there are resources available on that website. But here I'm highlighting, there's one for Jamaican Creole with questions in Creole and English translations, and then for use in English. As I said, don't be afraid to be creative. And we have used drawings with Jamaican children in order to understand their talking experiences. Why drawings? Well, drawings offer an ecologically valid way to understand the communicative experiences of young children. And what it does is that it engages children as experts in their own lives, while also giving them a voice in matters that concern them. So asking them to draw a picture about people who they're talking to, then asking them how they feel about their talking, are actually valid ways of communicating with children and understanding them, especially if you might not speak their language. Using drawings is also making us responsive to the United Nations Article 12 on Conventions of the Rights of the Child. And lastly, I mentioned here the position statement offered by the International Expert Panel on Multilingual Children's Speech. They have some tips where you begin by acknowledging that children are competent, capable, creative, and have individual characteristics. You recognize and you promote and value the different people in their environment. And you also acknowledge that there are recent technological advances that allow you to work with kids in creative and very responsive ways. Lastly, we encourage critical reflection about policies and practices and what those underlying assumptions might be and how those might impact how you respond to working with children who speak more than one language.
I think those are important considerations. Thank you for sharing. Great. The next question is, what has your research revealed regarding shared book reading and bilingual children who speak other languages? And we know that shared book reading is very important for emergent literacy.
Yes, thank you so much for this question. And for this question, I'm going to talk not necessarily about Jamaican Creole speaking children, but much more generally here. And the work that we have done has found that, and what we know about shared storybook reading is that regardless of the language spoken, the home environment is considered to be the most influential place to support reading. And it's more of an artificial construct compared to, say, vocabulary and social skills. This one you have to specifically point to, show, hold. So it doesn't just happen. It doesn't just occur naturally by osmosis that maybe other areas of language might. Reading is going to require much more active and artificial involvement. But we do know that there are positive outcomes, and our research has shown that with children who are monolingual or multilingual speakers, there are positive outcomes associated with parents reading to their children. So we completed a study with about 54 children from low income and from multilingual backgrounds. Some were multilingual and some were monolingual. What we included here, we included children, there were about 54 children and pairs of children with their parents. 11 different languages were spoken across all of those children. And you can see here the different number of participants for each of those. Now, this table is only specifically looking at a particular subgroup, but it was 11 languages in total. What we found was that of the children who were monolingual, if you received treatment, you outdid those who did not receive treatment, and gains were found in terms of their alphabet knowledge for uppercase, and also for their print concept knowledge and their beginning sound awareness, as well as home reading practices in general. Now, we found something a little bit different for children who are multilingual, who spoke more than one language. We found that yes, those who received intervention outdid those who did not. However, their print concept gains were only evidenced at post. They did not maintain their gains. But when it came to their beginning sound awareness, they were able to make achievements not only at the end of treatment, but also maintain those gains over time. You'll notice I did not mention anything about their alphabet knowledge because they did not make significant gains in that regard. So there are some differences that we observed that they might need a bit more time and instruction, because in fact, we found that for home reading practices in general, it took to the follow-up time frame to see gains in those compared to what we noticed for monolingual children. So is it that because they work with two different languages and two different language systems, they might need more time? One of the things with reading is, remember, between languages such as Arabic and then English, the format of reading is different. In English, we read front to back. Arabic, they read back to front. So those kinds of dynamics might need to be exercised more frequently with more practice before we begin to evaluate children in terms of their reading skills. So these were some of the instructions we provided. We gave a technique of the week, and we also gave specific instructions and a book that accompanied that technique of the week to go home with the parents. And so parents got 8 books freely into their new home library. And what we have found that giving specific written instructions, and the parents attended a training before they actually practiced. You gave hand over hand instruction with the parent and child present to actually demonstrate how the activity should be executed. That is something that parents actually anecdotally reported that was extremely beneficial to them to understand how they should read to their children.
Yeah, so the parent coaching is definitely very important for the literacy process for them.
Very, very important.
Before the reading, during the reading, after the reading, all of those different reading
Yes.
literacy strategies.
Yes.
Very important for them, the children to understand what's going on. And the final question for this evening, what is a significant consideration that speech-language pathologists should remember and implement to ensure they are providing culturally responsive assessment and therapeutic services?
Okay, I think I begin somewhat awkwardly maybe by saying, remember to first have your definition of what is multilingual.
Mm-hmm.
You know, be sure that you're on the same starting page, and I reorient you back to that definition offered by the International Expert Panel on Multilingual Children's Speech. So having that agreed upon definition is a great place to start. Secondly, having a broader conceptualization of what is typical and what is disordered. Remember that bilingualism doesn't occur in a vacuum. It occurs in a more dynamic fashion. And so features of one language are going to bleed over into features of the other. So what you think you might be hearing and thinking it might be broken English or disorder might not actually be that. Also, consider how disorder might be manifested in someone who is diverse, because it is possible for someone who's diverse to be disordered. Remember, consider what the features of the languages are versus what they are not. Don't use what you know about the ambient language to guide something about someone who's not a native speaker of the ambient language. And then, in making the appropriate determination about the need for speech and language services, try your best not to rely on those standardized measures in answering that question. I know it's easier. I know. I get it because of the time constraints a lot of our SLPs are facing, but I encourage you to use other ways. Get toy objects and play with the child, see what the child does. Because if you're administering a test to an individual on whom that test is not developed, it's not being used appropriately. And if they've not had enough exposure to the language you're testing them in, then it's not a valid result. So try to be less reliant on standardized ways of assessing a child's speech and language. And then lastly, I say don't rely on them, but for children who have had enough exposure to the ambient language, but still have room to grow, you can use standardized tests in non-standardized ways, sometimes as part of a dynamic assessment, to understand what does that child know about English for, say, vocabulary, for grammar, or for phonology. But remember, you're not scoring it. You're using it to give you an idea of maybe being able to set goals. And think also about those functional goals. So not just what is wrong with the child, but how, or what is not, I shouldn't say wrong with the child, what is actually the area of impairment, but how is it that in addressing what you think the child isn't achieving for their age range, how can you address that to help them be included with others? So addressing what we call more functional goals to allow children to be included with others.
Great.
And I end by showing a list of resources that I've also made available to you that you can share with your audience. But at the American Speech Language Hearing Association, Special Interest Group 14, which is Cultural and Linguistic Diversity, 17, Global Issues in Communication Sciences and Related Disorders. Those chats that they have, I learn a lot from them. I see I'm kept in the know. And so it's a community of people coming together because it takes a village. And I say teamwork makes the dream work. My friend, Dr. Erin Riedel says it, and I borrowed that from her. And so there's also the Multilingual Children's Speech website, which is rich in resources. A number of them are free resources that you can use for children who are on your caseload, who do not speak the same language which you do. And the panel, which the international expert panel, also provides some publications on strategies. For example, there's one in 2017 where we talked about speech assessment for multilingual children who do not speak the same language as a speech language pathologist. And it's a tutorial, so it's a how to do, which is really great. And there are a list of resources and techniques and strategies that you can use to help you bridge that gap. And you know what? Practice makes perfect. So don't feel that you're going to get this done overnight. The more children you work with who do not speak the same language or come from the same background as you, is the more comfortable and more competent, responsive, and cultural humility that you will experience that makes us all better speech and language pathologists. So thank you so much for your time today.
Excellent, excellent. I appreciate you so much, Karla, for sharing all this wonderful information for the speech pathologists that follow my blog and read my website and so forth. This is excellent information for us all to continue on our journey of being more culturally responsive. And then for them to learn some about Jamaican Creole and to recognize that speakers of Jamaican Creole who also speak standard Jamaican English, or in the States here, standard American English, are in fact bilingual, and it is not a dialect, it's its own independent language. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Washington. It has truly been a pleasure. Thank you
so much.